Lord knows what happened if you didn't partake. But back then, anyone who refused to get vaccinated would get ratted out immediately because we knew that person could hurt other people. The commonweal was a commonweal. Now we're engaged in a similar struggle with COVID, and Eisenhower would be aghast. We have immunocompromised people who are incubators for every variant to come, walking around lawfully unvaccinated? That's psychotic. We have companies that have tried hard to get people vaccinated and now backing down. We have governors who want to be president by grandstanding on a foolish states' right issue, the right to get sick, get other people sick. So it's time to admit that we have to go to war against COVID. Require vaccination universally. Have the military run it. If you don't want to get vaccinated, you better be ready to prove your conscientious objector status in court. And even then, you need to help in the war effort by staying home until we finally beat this thing.
Fuck you!
Dr. Fauci, as you advised the president about the possibility of new testing requirements for people coming into this country, does that include everybody?
The answer is yes, because you know that the new regulation, if you want to call it that, is that anybody and everybody who's coming into the country needs to get a test within 24 hours of getting on the plane to come here.
Well, what about people who don't take a plane and just these border crossers coming in huge numbers?
You know, but that's a different issue.
This asshole really should be arrested and prosecuted.
I should be prosecuted.
Yeah, that's right.
I should be prosecuted.
Yep.
You better lawyer up. You better lawyer up. You better lawyer up.
Because democracy basically means government by the people, of the people, for the people. But the people are retarded.
Then strangled them, and finally dismembered their bodies.
Right.
Then and homelessness and all that. And now, the voice you've been waiting for.
There is a secret song at the center of the world, and its sound is like razors through flesh. I'm here to turn up the volume.
Well, it only took about a week for a news story to come along that could so dominate the headlines that people would forget and stop talking about the SUV that plowed over dozens and dozens of people at a Christmas parade. As soon as the big corporate news started finding out the details of what had happened and who it was that did it, they couldn't wait for something to come along to distract from it. And you gotta love the way a lot of these outfits were framing the story, that it was an accident, that it was some kind of mistake, that this SUV had plowed over people. Not somebody driving an SUV plowed over people, but an SUV. Like it was on some kind of self-drive function that malfunctioned. Well, that story came along in the past week with the Omicron variant. Omicron being the 15th letter of the Greek alphabet and also an anagram of moronic. They actually skipped over a couple of letters in the Greek alphabet. This variant would have been called the new variant, NU, but I could see how that could be confusing because you'd hear new variant and you'd think NEW. So they skipped over that letter, and the next letter was going to be G, and they decided to skip over that. I wonder why that possibly could have been. So then this new variant became the Moronic variant. Excuse me, Omicron. As soon as news started spreading about this new variant with a large number of mutations in the spike protein, people started speculating all over the place that, oh, this may be something very dangerous and very transmissible, even though the very doctors that discovered and sequenced it and warned people said that all the cases they've had of the Omicron variant have been mild or asymptomatic. And all week long, we've had people like Dr. Shorty McShitstain doing all the TV rounds and being interviewed on this new variant saying, oh, well, this may pose a very serious problem. We don't know yet exactly how transmissible or how severe this particular strain is, but we should go ahead and freak out anyway. And for the second time in 6 months, he basically told an interviewer that he was the personification of science.
They get up and really aim their bullets at Tony Fauci. Well, people could recognize there's a person there, there's a face, there's a voice you can recognize, you see him on television, so it's easy to criticize. But they're really criticizing science, because I represent science.
And then he gets no pushback from her. Like, well, you know, science is all about asking questions, and sometimes, you know, science evolves and things change, as you well know with your whole mask thing. So shouldn't we be constantly asking more questions, trying to find out more? No, none of that, none of that. And he did basically the same thing about 5 months ago when he was being interviewed by Chuck Todd, basically said, oh, you criticize me, you criticize science.
It's very dangerous, Chuck, because a lot of what you're seeing as attacks on me, quite frankly, are attacks on science.
And not one single one of these so-called journalists in the past almost 2 years has asked him any tough questions or tried to get to the bottom of anything. They all just line up and wait their turn to toss his salad. And it makes perfect sense. I mean, it's not like he has any blemishes on his record.
The reception of Robert Kennedy Jr.'s book, The Real Anthony Fauci, is clear evidence of a mass awakening. The people are waking up to see Fauci for what he is, an absolute psychopath. We've learned of how he directed experiments at the NIAID in which beagles had their vocal cords removed and their heads enclosed in cages where sand fleas ate them alive. And we've learned of how he fraudulently used PCR tests to illegitimately push a known deadly drug upon tens of thousands of people. And many are now learning that in 1992, under the direction of Anthony Fauci, the NIAID funded drug trials on HIV-positive children. Although many of the children were healthy and asymptomatic, they had merely tested positive via faulty PCR tests administered through New York's Child Welfare Department, who then handed them over to the deadly experiments. Most of the drugs being tested on the children were already known to cause deformities, organ failure, brain damage, and other lethal side effects. And yet, the children were required to continue with the drugs regardless of negative side effects. Those administering the drugs were explicitly told that all adverse side effects they witnessed in the children were being caused by the HIV infection and not the drugs. When parents refused to consent to these barbaric trials, Children's Services took their kids and placed them with foster families or children's homes where participation in the trial would be assured. When the children resisted the deadly drugs, they were brought to Columbia Presbyterian Hospital, where plastic tubes were surgically inserted into their stomachs, and the deadly drugs they were trying to escape were pumped directly into their bodies. Once the children died, their bodies were added to a mass grave in Hawthorne, New York, a large pit with astroturf thrown over it. To get around the Nuremberg Code and other laws, the state of New York created a special review board comprised of the hospital stakeholders.
Then they try to make him out to be some kind of saint, when in reality he's probably one of the most corrupt people in all of Washington. It's also been a bad week for Chris Cuomo, the brother of former governor of New York Andrew Cuomo. The New York Attorney General decided to release a bunch of documents basically showing that he was stalking one of his brother's accusers and doing a lot more behind the scenes to try to help him than he had initially led on. He had been busted for doing this way back 8 months ago, and he issued an apology and said, "I'm wicked sorry" and everything. I'd feel some pity for him if he wasn't such a lying piece of shit.
Also interesting is, remember, it's illegal to possess these stolen documents. It's different for the media. So everything you learn about this, you're learning from us. And in full disclosure, let's take a look at what is in there and what it means.
See, that was a total fucking lie, and he knows better than that. He knows it's perfectly legal for members of the public to read WikiLeaks releases. He just fucking lied because he wanted to be the gatekeeper, and he wanted the network news to be the gatekeeper of what you actually heard and saw out of those. Of course, there was nothing problematic about that for CNN. I mean, actually, he was just doing his job and saying what they were telling him to say. And back in September, he'd been accused of what's being reported as sexual harassment by a former producer at ABC. She claimed that he came and hugged her at a party and grabbed her ass right in front of her husband. But even she's calling it just sexual harassment. From what I understand, once you get hands-on like that, it goes from being harassment to assault. But that was months ago, and CNN took no action on that. And in fact, it's actually being reported now like it's some kind of new revelation that he was accused of, quote, sexual harassment. But something about these new revelations was just too much. Now, these revelations were part of a release from Letitia James, the Attorney General in New York, and I haven't personally tried to even go through and look at what all got revealed. But CNN had hired an outside law firm to further investigate things after they suspended him, and then over the weekend, they terminated his ass. Hell, they even brought Jeffrey Toobin back. I mean, that guy got busted for jerking his gherkin right in the middle of a Zoom meeting with colleagues, just sitting there spanking his monkey, choking his chicken, because he thought that nobody could see him. I mean, you would think that would be the end of somebody's career, but now, 8 months later, they just brought his ass back, which makes me wonder if there isn't more information about to get dropped, because for some reason, this was a final straw. It went from a suspension to you're fucking fired, Fredo.
I can handle things, I'm smart! Not like everybody says! Like dumb, I'm smart!
And CNN was like,
You're nothing to me now.
So farewell to Fredo. After the past month of the never-ending coverage of the Rittenhouse trial and the trial of the shooting of Ahmaud Arbery, I guess they must have figured people are just burnt out for a couple days and decided not to cover a couple of trials. Well, they've mentioned the Gislane Maxwell trial, but there hasn't been a whole lot of reporting on it, and I haven't heard anything at all about the Juicy Smollett case out in Chicago. This is a story that a lot of people would like to forget. People like Robin Roberts there at GMA who did that little interview with him where he cried.
And I want a little gay boy who might watch this to see that I fought back.
It was already clear to a lot of people by then that he was totally full of shit. I mean, the day that I woke up and heard the breaking news story about how, in the middle of the night, while he was walking to get a sandwich, he got jumped by a couple of Trump supporters who, even though they're Trump supporters, recognized him as being an actor off of the Empire. Even when it's 20 degrees and he was probably bundled up like a fucking Eskimo, they just happened to have a noose and some bleach. And they tied the noose around his neck and poured bleach on him and roughed him up. The story just sounded ridiculous from the very start. And then I'm like, where is this? Oh, this is Chicago? Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm sure this really happened. And some people outside of the corporate networks were willing to ask questions and poke the holes in his story, which were fucking humongous. But nobody was really willing to go out on a limb and say, this guy's a fucking liar, because they weren't expecting him to be so stupid that he would get caught. They figured it would just be a hate crime hoax that, you know, you'd never be able to prove was a hoax, but whatever. Then the Chicago police made it a priority to figure this out, and it turned out to be a Nigerian scam. And when they arrested the two brothers that had planned this hoax with Smollett, they just rolled over and spilled all the beans about how it was a hoax, that he was doing it to try to further his career. And now he's in court claiming that those two Nigerian brothers were criminal masterminds that set him up. And now nobody at the corporate networks wants to even mention this because, of course, it doesn't follow along with the narrative that they're trying to push right now. And now we're also a week into the Gislane Maxwell trial, which, after seeing what happened with the way they handled Epstein, I have very little hope that this is anything more than a continuation of that cover-up. Now, since this is a federal case and not a state case like the Rittenhouse trial, you're not allowed to watch the court proceedings, but there are transcripts that are being released, and there are ways that you can actually listen into audio of the proceedings. Of course, the judge had ruled before the case started that certain details were going to be withheld from the public because they're just too sensational and impure, and we have to protect third parties.
Obviously, a lot of people are hoping that there will be a lot of information that comes out of this trial, not just about Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein, but really connects to this powerful group of people that they surrounded themselves with and seem to have influence over. We know that Ghislaine Maxwell, referred to nicely in the media as a socialite, was really kind of the epicenter of Jeffrey Epstein's sphere of influence and all the people that he was connected to. She was the fixer. She was the one who seemed to be connecting people to Epstein. The hope for a lot of people is that they'll get more information about who else was involved, but the likelihood of that, I think, is relatively small at this point, and there's a couple of reasons for that, including the fact that the lead prosecutor on the case is the daughter of someone who was heavily connected to many of the characters in the Jeffrey Epstein world, people like Bill and Hillary Clinton. As I mentioned, the daughter of former FBI director and Russia conspiracy hoax promoter James Comey is one of 3 lead prosecutors going after Ghislaine Maxwell. Well, she's taken on major cases before Maxwell's trial, including prosecution of Natalie Edwards, a self-proclaimed Treasury Department whistleblower, and Robert Hayden, a gynecologist accused of sexually abusing dozens of young women. By the way, she was also one of the lead prosecutors in the Jeffrey Epstein case before he committed suicide in his jail cell, which of course looks very much like he was suicided. But that aside, Maureen Comey was one of the prosecutors on that case that obviously never went to trial. There's also the issue of the judge in the case, Allison Nathan. She was John Kerry's Associate National Counsel in 2004. She was a Special Assistant and White House Counsel for Barack Obama from 2008 to 2010 and was appointed to the federal bench by President Obama. Interestingly, Nathan was also just last week appointed to the U.S. Second Circuit Court of Appeals by President Biden, something that she says obviously she will accept, but she's going to finish out this trial before she goes anywhere. Now, Nathan has already carefully scrutinized document redactions proposed by both Maxwell and prosecutors. She did grant Maxwell's request to keep secret, undisclosed, quote, sensational information contained in the court documents and transcripts, noting that removal of the material was necessary to protect the integrity of the investigation and the privacy of third parties who are not a part of the criminal case. So by removing third parties from the case, it's essentially the judge protecting the names of people who might be connected to Ghislaine Maxwell, but again, aren't being charged at this point. And if their names are never named, will they ever be charged? Look, none of what we know so far indicates that there is corruption involved yet. However, it certainly does raise this issue. Remember that the entire story that surrounds Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell is that they surrounded themselves with powerful political people, people who had authority and power in societies, people like former presidents, Bill Clinton, Jeffrey Epstein's connections to Donald Trump, Jeffrey Epstein's connections to Prince Andrew. Jeffrey Epstein was himself appeared to be a honeypot that was designed in order to entrap powerful, wealthy people and then have influence over them. Ghislaine Maxwell, remember, she was a guest at Chelsea Clinton's wedding, even after Jeffrey Epstein had gone through his original trial in which he had pleaded guilty to sex with a minor. And so what we do know is that there is a lot of political connection here for the people who are involved in prosecuting the case, the judge and the prosecutor. And again, while that might not be unusual, it might be problematic. The question becomes one of, can you trust what comes out of a trial about politically connected people when politically connected people are in charge of the trial? We'll find out, won't we?
Like I said, I don't have very high hopes here. They're doing everything they can to just wrap this up with a neat little bow so it can all go away and we can forget about all the very powerful movers and shakers that, in all likelihood, were compromised. That was what Acosta, the prosecutor that gave Epstein his sweetheart deal also many years ago, he said that he was told that Epstein was an intelligence asset and to let it go. And if anything was going to come out on all these powerful people, on the blackmail operations that people had against them, then it would have come out with Epstein. It's not going to happen now. I'll be highly surprised if anything really useful comes out of this trial. Of course, that being said, it is worth paying attention to because This is a perfect example of the way this world really works. Sláinte.
All I have in this world is my balls and my word, and I don't break them for no one. You understand? So say good night to the bad guy. 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 Come on. Come on. Look at you now.